Welcome to Lesson 13. Today we'll continue working with CSS. Just to recap, imagine hiring a builder and an interior decorator to finish your house. In that same way, HTML builds your page. CSS decorates that page. The next important thing to understand is the box model. Each HTML element is actually living inside its own box. There are 4 areas to our box. Going from innermost to outermost, they are content, padding, border, and margin. Once we understand these components to our box, we can use CSS to arrange them on the page. We can specify their position, how they float, if they overlap other elements, and if the content should overflow. So let's take a look at how boxes work. So let's take a look at how the box model works. So I'm going to incorporate a little bit of CSS in our page. Here I'm going to apply a CSS to the div. I'm going to specify the background color. This is going to indicate our content. I'm going to give it a width so that it stays the same size for all our content. And this width only applies to the content, not the whole box. The padding, this is the area around the content and it's transparent. The border, this is a border around the content and the padding, and it can be colorful. And the margin is the area outside the border and it's transparent. And so I've defined widths of 300, 25 with solid blue border, and the border is 25 pixels and the margin is 25 pixels. So and this is the content here we see. So let's take a look at the HTML. So I just have 3 divs, content before, then a big content about World of Warcraft, and a third one, content afterwards. So let's see how each of these affects each of these components here. Now, width just talks about the width of the content. If I change this to 30, we see the content has a width of 30, and since I didn't specify a height, this goes down here like that. The padding. So this is the area around the content. So that is this area between the content and the border here. So if I change this one to 2 pixels, you can see it becomes really tight. And if I change that to 29, you see there becomes more space. So that's the padding, and that's the area around the content. And this area is technically padding is technically transparent. We color the content with the background color. So now let's look at the border. If I change the border to 5 pixels, we see that the border becomes thin. It didn't affect the padding from here to the border, and it didn't affect the margins between elements. So let me change the border back. And now the margin. The margin is the area outside the border. So that means between this element and the next element, that's space. If I changed it to 5, you see the spacing in between the elements has decreased, while the content and the border size have stayed the same. Let me change that to margin to 50. You see that the margins increase the spaces between the elements. And that is the box model. Now let me change this back to 25. Now let's talk about flow within these boxes. So I create another class here, flow scroll. Let me change these positions for now. And so I'm going to apply this class to our big content here, so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so I gave it a height of 50, so you can see it changed to a height of 50, and it inherits the height from this one as well. And I changed the background color to brown, and overflow is hidden. What does that mean? All that extra text we have, it's now hidden. We have no scroll bars. We can't technically see it displayed on the page. We can change this overflow to scroll, and now we have scroll bars. So for our long content, we now have scroll bars. We can scroll up and down in this. But if we apply the same one to something that has very little content, it also gets scroll bars, which actually do not serve a purpose because there's nothing to scroll. So if we change this overflow to auto, we see that the long content gets a scroll bar, and it only gets one scroll bar. And this one doesn't get any scroll bars because the content is very small. So that's very useful. Now let's talk about the position. I'm going to remove the styling from the big element. Now, position absolute. So this tells the browser this element is going to be in a fixed place with 90 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the left. So if I hit save now, you see that it's moved here. It's not going anywhere else. Now let's see. Let me create another style. Floater. Float right. And I'm going to apply this style to our big element. We see this element is now floating to the right. This content afterwards went up relatively to the other element, but this content before stayed in the same position, all because we'd said position is absolute. Now if we change that, fixed works in a similar way. Let's see, relative. So when it's relative, the positions, the other elements move around this one. And we have more, let's see, let me get rid of that. Okay. So top left, we can even specify, let's see, right. 90 pixels. That. Let's see if we can get it to change. I think that will affect when you have a bigger div block. Doesn't affect too much. Okay, let me pause a bit.
Just come back to whatever you were doing.
Okay, so if I put this div, content before, inside another div, we see it becomes its position is relative in that box. Now let's apply this class to the div outside it and see what happens. Now this div floats to the right and takes this content with it. What happens when we do that? Now, because I put this one, flow scroll, back to position absolute, it has an absolute position. So even though it is inside this div, format that, here we go. So this one here, flow scroll, is living inside this one, what we called floater. It's staying in the same place, even though the div it lives inside is floating around. Let me add some text there. I'm floating. See, you can see the text there, and it's just floating off to the right, even though this one is staying in absolute position. So how can we use this to our advantage? So let me get rid of our positioning. Now we have everything like this. Let's say I've created a nav. Create a simple ordered list. Link 1, link 2. And we'll do something similar. And we'll have this one float left. So they're floating to the left. And we'll have our divs float to the right, all of them. So now we created a site with very, very simple navigation, a 2-column site. And as we open the page larger, we see the content moving around while our link are technically not moving. And so now that we can play around with this box model by adjusting the margins, the borders, the way it floats, positioning, the overflow. Wait, overflow hidden, overflow auto. Yep. We will soon be able to make more complicated designs now. And so let's keep practicing our CSS, practice making different widths, paddings, borders, margins, floating things to the right, float something to the left. Watch up. And that's it for the box model.